Okay, so we are actually looking at the second page of your notes, and we're going to focus on from air to, Brothers Power. I thought this was a nice, reasonable chunk of analysis that will work for just looking at the narrator and the tone. So the first thing you want to do is sort of pay attention to when is it the narrator and when is it just, you know, dialogue or something else. So I'm going to kind of put a star next to this paragraph because it's the narrator. Bracket that. Um, bracket that. Um, Here, sorry. And said she. I'm going to leave that alone. Going to underline that part because it's Nellie, the narrator, and this last part with the indignation because this is all Catherine talking. Okay, so if I said the first thing you wanted to do is well, not the first, but one of the things you want to do is figure out who's dominating the conversation or the pacing. We do notice that this is mostly dialogue, and that's the characteristics of, I'm sure you've noticed with the entire passage, but that doesn't mean that there isn't narrative quality to it that addresses the tone. So let's look at this first paragraph right here. Ere the speech ended, I became sensible of Heathcliff's presence. I like noticing that phrasing. I became sensible of Heathcliff's presence. So when we look at the word choice, we're going to notice that our narrator, Nellie, in this case, is aware of outsider, but you're also going to see that later on that she doesn't really admit this. So that tells us something about the narrator and her relationship with Catherine. So having noticed a slight movement, I turned my head, saw him rise from the bench and steal out noiselessly. He had listened till he heard Catherine say it would degrade her to marry him, and then he stayed to hear no further. My companion, sitting on the ground, was prevented by the back of the settle from remarking his presence or departure, but I started and bade her hush. So that's an interesting kind of contrast. What we get is our character, our narrator, Nellie, has information that the other character does not have. And that tells us something because when you look at the coloring of how she treats the very rest of this passage, and Catherine in this portion that I've selected, you're going to notice her tone towards Catherine shifts somewhat. If we looked at the beginning, she seems very flustered and frustrated by Catherine, and she still continues that frustration. But what you get here is almost frustration with sympathy. And all of that is seen or started by this little bit of facts that we have an awareness of Heathcliff, the outsider, but sort of a rejection of the reality of that in connection with Catherine. Okay, so we get those details. You will notice that there's not a lot of, not much, there's a U there, sorry, commentary. I'm going to just abbreviate that, but rather listing of facts. And that also breeds the sympathy that I stated before. Now let's look at why, she asked, gazing nervously around. I told you to pay attention to adjectives. So we had, I like sensible, that's a noun there, but nervously around. That's an adverb technically, but it's characterizing Catherine. And if we remember, it's our narrator telling the story, so she, Nellie, is actually characterizing Catherine's emotions as nervous. Again, connecting to the sympathy. Joseph is here, I answered, catching opportunely, I like this word, the roll of his cartwheels up the road. So opportunely tells us a lot about Nellie, because with this word, she sees the advantage and keeps her deceit. And that's interesting. That's another aspect of tone. So that level right here, we have the two contrasting adverbs in a sense, because nervously applied to Catherine, opportunely applied to Nellie. That one reiterates the frustration. She doesn't like Catherine. You can get those feelings about her because of how much she chides Catherine for her emotions and her reactions and everything that she says. And I left out a lot of this passage. I cut some parts down to help you to keep it on 2 pages, but you will see that there's that sense of contrasting emotions. She is frustrated by her with this opportunity, and she doesn't mind lying to her, but she does have a sense of sympathy for her. Okay, a couple more things to talk about. Oh, he couldn't have overheard me, said she. This is where Catherine talks about how he couldn't possibly know what love is. I see no reason that he should not know as well as you. I returned. I like this is interesting, again, it adds to frustration. Oops, there's an R there. So we get our narrator, Nellie, in this case, sort of again is reminded of the fact that she does not approve of Catherine's dismissal of Heathcliff's humanity. And her easy way of saying, oh, he couldn't possibly know. So this, I returned without any markings, without any descriptors, sort of shows that coldness and returns to that outsider, or not outsider, but the judgment that Nellie holds on Catherine, and sort of relinquishes some of the sympathy she feels for her. And then she tells her, because Miss Catherine, and the response to Catherine, I think, is interesting, and that's kind of the last thing we'll talk about. She exclaimed an accent of indignation. This statement reveals the narrator's, I'm going to just abbreviate, judgment of Catherine. I'm going to call her Kathy because slightly lazy. Because we have that accent of indignation. An accent is a description of how someone speaks, and what Nellie applies to her understanding of Catherine is that her accent is in connection with indignation. So essentially, Nellie, our narrator, is judging Catherine, and also sort of saying that she is. This is almost born in her. I'll write that down. Born in judgment. So, because it goes back to this idea of the noun and the accent. Most of this passage is told through dialogue. When we get to that video, you will spend a lot more time looking at the ins and outs of the word choice in there. But I wanted to show you and showcase just those small aspects of narration and point of view. Sensible, nervously, we looked at a few adjectives and nouns and descriptive nouns. We looked at the absence of a thing, which is still a thing. We talked about the word choice of accent. And that's something that you're clarifying. What is the word choice? How invested is the narrator? We could spend some time looking at Nellie's dialogue, but I wanted to save that for later, because you do see a lot of her characteristics in her judgment of Catherine, and Catherine's sort of a willingness to let go of everything because she's so invested in her own emotions and so self-involved. Okay, so remember, narrator and looking at tone, you are going to apply lots of different words to describe it. I focused on the balance of frustration and sympathy, and how in just this little bit you do see Nellie sort of juggle these two contrasting emotions. Okay.